I could not be more thrilled to have today as a guest in Eliamev's podcast series, Professor Eugene Rogan, Professor of Modern Middle Eastern History at Oxford University, and one of the great historians, the leading historians of the modern Middle East. Professor, thank you so much for finding the time to have this discussion with us, with Eliamev, in this very difficult time, one more difficult time for the Middle East, because we are again there in a very dangerous time. I think, although it seems that maybe or maybe not, we can see a light at the end of the tunnel. I'm not very sure about that. You will tell us. And we need to understand why it is almost impossible to break this circle of violence between Israelis and Palestinians. And has this circle begun in 1948, on the 7th of October, 2023, or maybe many, many years before all that?
Well, Odin, firstly, let me thank you for the honor of the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you. And I think it's a really important moment to be considering the history as well as the future of the Middle East, because we are at an important historic crossroad. The measures taken in the past 24 hours to end the war in Gaza are opening the prospect for contemplating a Middle East beyond war. I don't wish to be overly optimistic, but I feel as though we have reached a kind of historic crossroad that does begin in 1948. At that time, the war in Palestine was to lead to the creation of the State of Israel, as well as the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians into exile from their own country. That process was completed in 1967, when Israel's total victory over its neighbors led to its complete conquest of the territory of Palestine. But it meant that there was a large and growing population of Palestinians living under Israeli occupation. And 2023 was to demonstrate the contradictions of the occupation and is forcing Israel, Palestine, and the international community to face the reality of a situation in which there are just over 7 million Israeli Jews and just over 7 million Palestinians sharing the land of Mandate Palestine. They cannot continue to do so under the terms of the occupation. They've never been more distrustful of each other, as they have been since the violence of 7 October 2023 and the war that was to follow. But the need to move towards a resolution to this conflict that will be just and enduring has never been more obvious to all of the participants or to the international community.
But is the international community, the United States, EU, ready to pressure both Israel and the Palestinians to find a solution? I mean, we have now this plan, okay, the plan of Donald Trump, but will that be viable without discussing the creation of a Palestinian state?
I think the discussion of the creation of a Palestinian state has been advanced more strongly in 2025 than ever before. And that's a very Eurocentric comment. Excuse me. I apologize to viewers from outside the continent of Europe. Over 140 countries had already recognized the state of Palestine before 2025. But by getting some of the European heavyweights, such as Britain and France, Spain, Belgium, Denmark, Sweden, on board to recognize Palestine, and for that to be seconded by leading G7 countries like Canada or other important states like Australia, has really been an important change in the reality of recognition of Palestinian statehood. It's not just a symbolic gesture. This is now very important countries in the world economy and in world diplomacy saying that in the face of a genocidal conflict, that the solution has to be based on two states, and to advance that vision, they now recognize the state of Palestine. So this is a very important development that is part of what the Trump plan bringing this conflict to an end is building on, even if the United States has yet to recognize Palestine itself.
Well, if we take a look back, do you think that in 1948 there could have been then also a Palestinian state? Because it's something that many people do not know. Some people think that the Palestinians could have accepted a state there. Is that the truth? What happened in 1948, Professor?
1948 was, in a sense, the fulfillment of a partition plan that had been voted on by the United Nations General Assembly in November of 1947. Faced with a conflict that had emerged in the course of the British Mandate in Palestine, which spanned from the 1920s through the 1940s, the international community believed that it was no longer possible for the Arab and Jewish populations of Palestine to live together. And so a majority recommendation of a UN Commission of Inquiry called for the partition of Palestine. There was a minority report that insisted that partition would be a formula for conflict, but that minority report, which today looks realistic, was not acted upon. The problem with the partition plan agreed by the United Nations was that it created the sort of checkerboard of territory, where you had squares of Palestinian land next to squares of Israeli land, meeting at what they called kiss points, little crossroads where the territories became very narrow and joined each other. And it was really a formula for war because neither the state of Palestine nor the state of Israel would have been viable as drafted by the UN partition resolution. And so once the British withdrew from Palestine, in 14th of May, 1948, Palestine witnessed both the declaration of the State of Israel in the territories allocated by the UN and the beginning of invasion of Palestine by neighboring Arab states to prevent the creation of the State of Israel. It led to the first Arab-Israeli War. But already by May of 1948, Israeli forces, or pre-Israeli forces, the Haganah of the Jewish community of Palestine before statehood, had effectively driven Palestinians to flee from large parts of northern Palestine, major cities like Haifa and Safad and Beisan and Jaffa. And you had the beginning of the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians even before the situation was declined into war. With the entry of the armies of Transjordan, of Egypt, of Iraq, later Syria, Lebanon, into the conflict, I think the scope for a Palestinian state to have emerged alongside Israel was zero. This was a conflict in which both sides were trying to deny the other the chance of statehood. The Arab states intervened in Palestine to prevent the creation of a Jewish state, and the new Jewish state was fighting a war to deny the possibility of a Palestinian state. And they fought until Israel had conquered 78% of the territory of Mandate Palestine before the war was brought to an end and armistice lines were drawn in 1949. But at that point, the remaining territory of Arab Palestine was reduced to the West Bank, which came under Jordanian rule along with East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, which came under Egyptian administration.
So, if you look back again in the history of the region, what role did the great powers play? And has that changed now? I mean, do the great powers play again a huge role in the Middle East? Or now you have also the regional powers that play maybe an even more important role? I mean, we had then the United States, we had the Soviet Union, of course, always Great Britain or France in the region. But now we have also Syria, we have also Turkey, we have Egypt. So have things changed there on who and what countries can play a role, can press the situation in the region?
We've seen so many changes since the creation of the State of Israel and the Palestinian Nakba in 1948. The one thing we shouldn't forget is that there was a major transformation of global politics from the imperial power of Britain and France dominating the Middle East to the Soviets and the Americans coming to be the dominant powers during the Cold War. And in a sense, the Second Arab-Israeli War brought that transition to a head when you saw Britain and France collude with Israel to invade Egypt, to seize the Suez Canal that had been recently nationalized by Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser. It was a transparent bid to topple a Nasser that was not complying with the European powers, Britain and France, or with the United States. It looked like it was leaning to the Soviet Union. It was, of course, a measure that was to backfire for the Israelis, the British, and the French. They were all forced to withdraw from Egypt after the Suez Crisis of 1956. And I think from that point forward, you would see the influence of the Soviets and the Americans turning the Middle East, and the Palestine-Israel conflict in particular, into a theater of the Cold War. But that was to distort the scope for the great powers to actually resolve the conflict. It simply put constraints on what either of the superpowers, the Soviets or the Americans, could do without provoking the intervention of the other superpower. And so the third Arab-Israeli conflict in 1973 witnessed just such an escalation, where an Arab-Israeli war brought in the powers of the Soviets and the Americans. It was the closest after the Cuba Missile Crisis that the Cold War ever came to a thermonuclear risk, the Soviets putting their nuclear deterrent on high alert during the 73 war. And after that, I think it was basically a stalemate in which there were various attempts at negotiating a peace between Israel and the Arab states. This was advanced by Egypt's breaking ranks with the Arab states and concluding a peace with Israel in the 1970s, in 1979, the Camp David Accords. And I think then we saw a kind of stabilization where there was no war but no peace in the Middle East. And that would last really right through to the end of the Cold War. And I suppose the next major change would come with America's growing intervention in Middle Eastern affairs, to some extent after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1991 with the Desert Storm Gulf War, but even more in the age of the War on Terror, when the United States declared war on Iraq to topple Saddam Hussein and found American forces drawn into what they increasingly came to see as never-ending wars in the Middle East. This led to a period where the United States tried to withdraw from its commitments in the Arab world, and that was to be followed by the Arab Spring of 2011. And I think between 2011 and 2023, there was a real sense that the Middle East was getting by. There were no pressures to try and resolve Israel-Palestine. It seemed to be more or less stable under occupation. And the first Trump administration tried to advance a change in the formula through the Abraham Accords of gaining broader recognition for Israel in its Arab neighborhood without addressing the occupation of Palestinian territory. And that's what blew up in 2023. In a sense, that was what shook the world out of its complacency, that you could do business in the Middle East without really resolving the fundamental conflicts that had been causing turbulence in the Middle East, the Israel-Palestine conflict.
What about Turkey, Professor? Turkey has a long history with the Ottoman Empire in the whole region. What about now? What's the role that Turkey is playing or wishes to play or can be accepted to play?
Well, in a sense, you were alluding to that in your previous question, Odin, and I didn't get to it. You were talking about the role of regional powers, and Turkey is certainly a very important one. It's not the only one, as we have seen particularly in the period since the Arab Spring after 2011. I would say that the withdrawal of the United States created a sort of vacuum that was filled by regional players. So Turkey, very effective during the Arab Spring in providing a kind of role model for what was then perceived to be an Islamic democratic movement. Many in the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt or its affiliates in Tunisia, in Syria, even in Gaza, with Hamas being a sort of offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, looked to Turkey as a role model and as a supporter. They also looked to some of the wealthy states in the Gulf, such as Qatar. But I would say that the really influential regional powers, Turkey, Iran operating through Shiite partners in Lebanon, through alliances with Syria, with Hamas in Gaza, and with the Houthis in Yemen was able to be a real power broker in the region. And Saudi Arabia has really emerged as another very influential regional player that has played a key role in shaping the politics of the Arab world in the 21st century. And in a sense, there is a competition or a rivalry that has emerged between these regional powers that were more influential, more present in the Middle East in, let's say, the second decade of the 21st century than any of the great powers of the time. And these tensions or rivalries between, let us say, the UAE and Saudi Arabia on one hand, and Qatar on the other, all based around their respective views of a Muslim Brotherhood vision of Islamic politics. The Saudis and Emiratis really opposed to that. The Qataris and Turks actually very supportive of it. And then everyone being very concerned about Iran's influence, the role of its encouragement of Shiite proxies in the region or other Islamist factions in the region, seen as very destabilizing, just meant that the rivalries and interactions between regional powers were in many ways more influential over the past 10 or 15 years than anything Europeans or the Americans have done.
Well, if we look at the national aspiration, both of Palestinians and the Israelis, and how the land is in Israel, where is the West Bank, Gaza, where do you think that a real solution lie? How can there are two states?
I think many people have dismissed the possibility of a two-state solution as now over. They believe it is too late, that the expansion of Jewish settlements in the West Bank and the war in Gaza have created realities on the ground that makes the creation of a viable Palestinian state a virtual impossibility. I disagree. And I feel that the past 2 years of violence has demonstrated that it is not possible for Palestinians and Israelis to live under the same authority. The occupation breeds resistance. We must remember that Hamas, the Arabic name, is an acronym, and at the very center of that name is the word muqawama, resistance. Occupation engenders resistance, and that resistance can be extraordinarily dangerous to Israel. The 7th of October was the worst attack Israel has ever suffered. And I think it has left many in Israel very traumatized and very doubtful that they can ever live with the Palestinians. My view is they cannot live with the Palestinians under their occupation. And so we must look at how two states can be achieved. And in my view, there are many models of what such a territorial compromise could look like. I would look at either the tri-state area of New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey, or the Benelux countries in Europe of Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, as small territories that have open borders for the movement of persons and goods and capital. But whereas you move across frontiers, you go from the sovereign law of one state to another. There's no boundary checks, there's no restrictions. You drive your car freely from one territory to the
You're
next.
talking
But
like France-Switzerland borders now.
well,
Yeah.
absolutely. But I think we have a notion of hard borders that gets in the way of seeing what the possibilities might look like of having an open border between Gaza, Israel, and the West Bank without worrying about trying to create a land bridge. Just create a road. And if a driver exceeds the speed limit on the Palestinian side of the frontier, they're going to get a speeding ticket from the Authority of Palestine. If they happen to be on the Israeli side, a speeding ticket from the Israelis. In this way, you let sovereignty determine where the state power begins and ends. But this would mean the withdrawal of all Israeli forces from the sovereign territory of Palestine, which has now been recognized by a number of European countries, Canada and Australia. So this sovereign territory of Palestine is becoming increasingly real. And so now we must look at the modalities in which that can be acted upon, because then if you withdraw all Israeli troops, it changes the dynamic of the settler movement in the West Bank, for instance. The settlers are enabled by the presence of Israeli soldiers. Many of those settlers will not want to live in sovereign Palestine. Many of them will, and they should be allowed to stay as Israeli expatriates living in Palestine. No reason for that to be a problem. But as people begin to move out of settlements, because some will want to stay, others will not, and will want to move back into Israel, those houses become the property of the state of Palestine and can be reallocated to Palestinians in need of accommodation. Suddenly, settlements will stop being these apartheid enclaves that separate Israelis from Palestinians and will become mixed communes. This changes the dynamic enormously. And only those settlers who can find a modus vivendi with their Palestinian neighbors will really be comfortable staying in Palestine. So I think in this way, we can even imagine blunting the impediment of settlements just through recognizing the sovereignty and the law of the state of Palestine. And the third thing is I would actually open that open frontier notion of sovereignty with Jordan. Jordan, which has a very large Palestinian population and has been very implicated in Israel-Palestine and their conflict since Jordan annexed the West Bank and East Jerusalem after the 1948 war and lost them in the 67 war. And I think Jordan has always been an anchor of stability. It would really help to normalize these open borders and free movement. And if we could just get beyond the conflict, Odin, it doesn't take much imagination to see the political and economic potential of such a three-state solution of Jordan, Palestine, Israel, with open frontiers, the free flow of ideas, capital, people, because everywhere Israelis, Palestinians, and Jordanians have gone outside their own countries, they have been so successful. These are highly educated, highly motivated, very brilliant people. And they actually get on remarkably well with each other outside the context of war. I know they're deeply divided, Odin, but so too were the French and the Germans after the Franco-Prussian War of the 1870, World War I and World War II, and today they are the closest of allies. We can imagine moving from the terrible conflict that we know in 2025 to a very better future.
But do you believe that the leaders play a role in all that? I mean, it's now Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, not someone like Yitzhak Rabin. We have Hamas. Okay, we don't have Yasser Arafat. So does that play a role in what can be decided? And also, does religion play a role, negative or positive?
So these are really important questions. And in essence, we have been captive to the ideologies of radical movements in trying to resolve Israel-Palestine. And if you like, the cabinet of Prime Minister Netanyahu, which includes many very right-wing members who are strong supporters of the settler movement and who would like to annex all of the territory and make all of Palestine into Israel. They are extremists. And they are, in many ways, similar to Hamas in its aim for exclusive control over an Arab Palestine. We must break the capture that extremists have on the Palestine-Israel conflict if we hope to resolve it, because the extremists will not get what they want. There will not be a Jewish Palestine from the river to the sea any more than there will be an Arab Palestine from the river to the sea. There has to be states for the peoples of Israel and Palestine that live at peace with each other. And there is a very large majority in the center of the political spectrum of both countries that are open to that. But we will need to see a changing government, both in Palestine and in Israel. For the government of Prime Minister Netanyahu has made a firm commitment that they will never allow Palestinian statehood. So this government is an impediment to resolving the crisis, and we must leave it to Israeli voters to choose whether they wish to resolve the conflict on the basis of two states at peace with each other side by side, in which case they will need to elect politicians committed to that vision. But I am hoping that in the aftermath of this new peace accord and the recent spate of recognitions by long-standing friends of Israel, that indeed Israelis will want to break out of the isolation into which Netanyahu's government is taking them and end the conflict that has raged since 1948 in an enduring and just way, and elect a new leadership that promises them peace through two states. And I think this is a moment for a restructuring of the politics of Israel along just such lines, those committed to preserving Israel without a Palestinian state, the right-wing vision, and the centrist vision that would rather see two states than to undermine the Jewish nature of the state of Israel by trying to keep 7 million people under occupation.
Do the United States under Donald Trump understand that there must be a Palestinian state so that peace will be a permanent fixture in the Middle East?
Well, in a sense, these are the weaknesses of Trump's 20-point peace plan, is that I don't believe the United States has come to the same recognition that many of its closest allies have, that you need to move towards the separation of Palestinians and Israelis into two states. But Trump is a very mercurial president. His policies change regularly. And I think he's committed to resolving the conflict. I'm not entirely sure what his motives are, but he has been applying great pressure from his position in the White House to resolve the conflict. And so I suppose now, as public intellectuals weigh in, other world leaders weigh in, that the part of the effort will be to persuade the Americans to support a vision of two states, and in so doing, to move towards what will ultimately stabilize this conflict region.
Professor Rogan, thank you so much. Thank you for making us understand and look at the bigger picture in the region. And we will welcome you in Athens in a few days' time. You will have a discussion about the Middle East with Professor Loukas Tsoukalis. Of course, we will be there to listen to the both of you. I thank you so very much.
I look forward to seeing you there, Odin. Thank you again.
Thank you.